Good evening and welcome to the lecture that inaugurates the 10th anniversary of the Dorothy Thompson Civil Rights Lectures. Dorothy was the first director of the Office of Affirmative Action at Kansas State and later was associate counsel for the university. In these capacities, she did her best to encourage us to maintain and to help us maintain our commitment to those rights guaranteed us in the Bill of Rights. Dorothy was as near an absolutist on the right to free speech as I've ever known, and yet she also drafted the sexual and racial harassment policies at the university. She was able to do this and to defuse tense discussions by her wonderfully ironic sense of humor. It's an honor for me to be here. To introduce our first speaker tonight, there's another wonderful member of the committee that's selecting the speakers, and that is the Research, News, and Features Coordinator in the Media Relations and Marketing Department for Kansas State University, Keener Tippin.
Good evening. Anyone that truly knows me knows about right now, I'd probably rather be having root canal surgery than be in front of you. But my acceptance of the request to introduce tonight's guest speaker speaks volumes of the wealth of respect I have for him and for the important message he brings. The events of 9/11 have forever changed this country and the world. Not only were thousands of innocent lives lost, but many of our rights as well from the resulting war on terrorism and many of the anti-terrorism measures designated to eliminate the terrorist network and prevent future attacks. Rights that we thought guaranteed by the Constitution and protected by international law are either in serious jeopardy or have already been eliminated. Thank goodness for Michael Ratner. Michael Ratner is president of the Center for Constitutional Rights in New York. He serves as co-counsel in Rasul versus Bush, the historic case of Guantanamo detainees before the U.S. Supreme Court, which affirmed the right of every person, citizen, or non-citizen detained by the United States to test the legality of his or her detention in a U.S. court. Under Michael's leadership, the CCR has aggressively challenged actions by the United States in the wake of 9/11 that increasingly restrict civil liberties under the unfolding terms of a permanent war. In the 1990s, Michael acted as a principal counsel in a successful suit to close the camp for HIV-positive Haitian refugees on Guantanamo Bay. He has written and consulted extensively on Guantanamo, the Patriot Act, military tribunals, and civil liberties in the post-9/11 world. He has also been a lecturer of international human rights litigation at the Yale Law School and the Columbia School of Law, president of the National Lawyers Guild, special counsel to Haitian President Jean-Bertrand Aristide, and co-host of the civil rights show Law and Disorder. He has recently co-authored the book Guantanamo, What the World Should Know, a primer on the dangers that U.S. policy in Guantanamo presents to our democracy. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my honor to introduce to you Mr. Michael Ratner.
Well, thank you for that great introduction. That actually made root canal look painless to me. So, so we're in good shape. Before I start, I was told to specifically mention, and I'm actually glad to mention it, the table that's not with my books on it, which you should know about anyway, but the table beyond that on the glass doors is the Kansas State Alliance for Peace and Justice, which has a sign up and is particularly, I think, talking about the draft, which is something I was just going to mention because I have a 14 and a 16-year-old. and they're both going to be subject. One's a daughter, one's a son, but this is going to have at least that level of equality if we go forward with the draft. In fact, I noticed myself looking up citizenship in other countries the other day. And you can buy citizenship in various places. You can invest in Canada. It'll cost you between $300,000 and $800,000. You then got to move there, which is, well, it depends on whether you like cold weather. You can go to Mexico for, I think it's 45,000 times the daily wage, which is probably less than Canada. But in any case, we have the corresponding group in New York, United for Peace and Justice, which was involved in the major demonstrations against the Republican convention. So I encourage people to get active in it. I want to say that I had a very nice dinner with the committee here, and now I see the people here. And what I don't understand when I see everybody is how come we're not winning? But we're not right now. We're winning in certain respects, but we're not winning in the way I want to win. I also, on the way out here, it was a great relief for me to come out to Kansas, because in my office every day, there's a little pamphlet that's going around, but the kind of work I do and the kind of tension and pressure that's on my office and myself right now is really heavy. I mean, I sit down in the morning and I don't leave my seat for 12 or 15 hours unless it's to go see clients or do litigation. We're working on the Guantanamo cases, which I'll talk about. We're working around the torture cases in Iraq, and we have a lawsuit against two of the private torture companies, Titan and Khaki. We have a case in which a man was rendered to Syria for the purposes of torture. You may have heard of the case. It's in that book. It's called the Arar case. He was a Canadian citizen, and the Canadians actually put out a travel advisory saying, even though you're a citizen of Canada, if you aren't born in Canada, you should not travel through the United States because you might be what they call rendered to a country where the United States sends you for purposes of being tortured. Because of the Canadian government, we got him out, but he was beaten very badly. We're working on a huge number of cases involving Muslim people who were scapegoated after 9/11, still going on all over the world. And we've been lately doing all the fallout from the Republican convention, both our efforts to get a hold of Central Park for people, as well as a building they now call Guantanamo on the Hudson, which is where they kept people for up to 3 days after the convention. So when I got off the plane in Kansas City, I saw this beautiful countryside, and what's the first thing I see? Well, I went and I bought a hat, because this they don't have east of the Mississippi. Cabela's, right? So you go to Cabela's and you think the whole world is perfect, other than the fact that it's loaded with guns and ammunition and all that. But there's all these tropical fish, or I don't know if they're tropical, but big fish in these tanks. And so that made me feel like, well, I can escape this for a little while. But really, of course, we can't. We can't escape it here, as I know some people in the audience have already talked to me about some things that have happened to people here in terms of homeland security. And you just can't really escape it anywhere. The repression really going on now anywhere in the world. The hat I usually put on for these demonstrations, or these talks, is almost, I've never used it yet actually, but it's called the Guantanamo Bay Bar Association. And you can't really see it. It has a little palm tree up there, and because that's the, whatever they call Guantanamo, when I debate people, they always say, oh, they don't even have to pay to get there. It's this luxury resort. But the hat has never been used by me, because even though I've represented people in Guantanamo for 3 years, really represented their families is the better way to say it, I've actually never got to see my clients. And even though we won a Supreme Court case on June 28th of this year, some 3 months ago, only one lawyer so far have we been able to get down to Guantanamo to see a client. So that's the Guantanamo Bay Bar Association. The other thing that struck me, and I'm sure many of you have looked at the book, I looked at the book on the way out here. It's called What's the Matter with Kansas? And it's about how Kansas, for some reason, is voting, the people of Kansas are voting against their economic interests and voting for the Republicans all the time, and they're voting on social issues, wedge issues, and it's really a discussion of how the Democratic Party has lost its roots in terms of a working class party. But it's quite a good book. I've read some of it. But when I ask myself what's the matter with Kansas, I say, well, it's not just what's the matter with Kansas, it's what's the matter with the rest of the country. I mean, I can't say that I understand it, because I don't. But if I look at the issues that a lot of us are familiar with, the issues like the deficit, lack of jobs, Medicare, raising of Medicare prices, privatizing everything, including, any river you might want to fish in someday, the mercury in our fish, roads through roadless wildernesses. All of those kinds of issues are issues that I just don't get it, how the people can continue to vote in the way they are with those issues. And then there's the second and third areas that I've done a lot of work on. One is the war with Iraq, that we were totally lied to about the reasons for going into Iraq, both the al-Qaeda and the weapons of mass destruction, and of course what's going on now. And one thing when I think about Iraq is, I wrote a book called Against the War with Iraq, and I went back and I looked at what I said, and I can't figure out how come I was so much smarter than the CIA and the president, and said in the book, one, they don't have weapons of mass destruction, there's no evidence, and secondly, you're going to lead to a civil war in Iraq and it's going to be a disaster. So that's the second issue. I just don't get it. I don't get it. And the third issue, which is really the area I'm here to talk about more, is what's happened to constitutional rights, what's happened to international law, and what's happened to law in the United States. And the areas I work on the most are some of what I described, but they're the idea of indefinite detentions, torture, the end of really checks and balances on the executive. In other words, when you look at an executive or a king or a president, you want to restrict that person's power, or else you're moving toward what I call a police state. When an executive can just pick and choose, I'm going to arrest that person tomorrow and stick him in Guantanamo, or arrest that person the next day and stick them in a Navy brig in South Carolina, and they're not going to get access to a court. You're really talking about the end of checks and balances, the end of democracy, and that's how serious, as I go on with this talk, you'll see things are. In addition, when you talk about things like torture or the military commissions they're going to use, you're also talking about the end of America's moral authority in the world. Not that we ever were obviously any paradigm of moral authority, but we certainly, through our human rights reports and through other ways, took a stance against torture, against military commissions, against indefinite detentions. And now, of course, we don't have that moral authority any longer because we are engaging in those very practices. I actually think of the world now as a dog-eat-dog world, as if we're going back to a medieval time, a time before the Enlightenment, a time of divine right of kings. It's that, in some way, it's that dark out there right now. In some way, I don't envy people who are younger than I, because when I grew up, as many of the people I've talked to here, in the 60s, when we had an incredible movement for social change in the country. We succeeded in many respects, whether it was getting people out of Vietnam or with regard to the women's movement or the black movement. And my son says to me, "Daddy, you had such good opportunities. What do I have? Look what I'm facing." And one of my answers to him is always, there are still, history does change. It's not static. It doesn't always get worse. It can go from worse to better. But there's no law that says it can go from worse to better. It only goes from worse to better with incredible struggle, with incredible protest, and incredible movement by people. And I learned that lesson through historically over time, as I said, as we won the Vietnam War with our protests, as even after I saw King assassinated and Kennedy assassinated, we wound up with struggle, with the Civil Rights Act, with the Voting Rights Act, with lots of victories. And I even saw it in the Guantanamo cases. I took the Guantanamo cases on January 10th, 2002, hopeless cases, 4 months after 9/11, hate mail that you couldn't believe. What am I doing that? It was a hard decision for all of us. Thought we had no chance in the world in winning those Guantanamo cases. But on the other hand, we saw the issue, even though I thought at the time that some of the people I might be defending might have been 9/11 people who attacked the towers, I still said the issue that people can be thrown into a prison, an offshore prison, never go into a court, not be allowed to go into a court, and have the key thrown away, was so fundamental to American justice and to justice in general that I felt the people had to be defended. And incredibly, which is what the New York Times called the most important civil rights case in the last 50 years, we won in the Supreme Court and won the right that every single person detained by the United States, really anywhere in the world, has a right to test the legality of their detention in a court. And when I say the most important decision in the last 50 years, You living in Kansas know what 50 years ago was. 50 years ago was Brown v. Board in 1954. So really people looked at it as the most important decision since Brown v. Board. But the lesson I've learned in this is really that it takes fighting, resistance, and speaking out. And as I said, the bad is only followed by the good when there is resistance. Popular resistance, and we're seeing it now. I'm not pessimistic in that sense. I remember New York after February 15th, the New York Times, after the February 15th demonstrations against the war with Iraq, New York Times said, well, there's now a second superpower in the world, and that's people's ability to get out and protest and demonstrate. And there were thousands of demonstrations all over the world. Did we stop the war? No. But we certainly did our best and proved that millions of people around the world were opposed to the continued war making. And we did the same thing at the Republican National Convention. There were up to 1 million people at that one march that United for Peace and Justice had a couple of days before the convention. So it's not, while it's a time of tremendous difficulty in the country, it's also not a time without hope and without a lot of protest. One question is, where are we now? And as I will describe the area I know best, it's the area, as I said, of Guantanamo, of torture, of enemy combatants, and the rule of law. We're really, other than that victory we had in the Supreme Court, which in many ways was a miracle, of course it shows how far off this administration was, that they had a moderate Supreme Court still hand them a defeat. We're in some ways at a nadir, at a low point in terms of our legal rights. And as I said, it feels like a period, it feels to me like an inquisitorial period, like the Inquisition, where you can subject people to torture to get them to tell the truth. And I always, in these talks, I used to talk, before the Supreme Court decision, I used to talk about the Magna Carta. Now, why do I know anything about the Magna Carta? Well, I'm a lawyer, so we know a little about the Magna Carta. But my son studied the Magna Carta 2 years ago, and I tested him on it. And there I read Article 39 of the Magna Carta. What does it say? It says that every single person who is seized by the government, the king in that case, King John, has a right to a trial before they can be put in jail, a right to a trial of his or her peers. And so I always cite the Magna Carta when I talk about Guantanamo. And the year was 1215. And I always say, well, for this government, for the Bush administration, the year is 1214. It's as if we've gone back 900 years before the Magna Carta, because they no longer believe that. They really don't. And what was amazing to me is when Justice Stevens wrote the opinion in that case that we won, Rasul v. Bush, representing the Guantanamo detainees, they went back and they cited the Magna Carta. What they went back and they said, since John at Runnymede was forced to sign the Magna Carta in 1215, it is understood that every single person can go into a court to test the legality of their detentions. So serious did the Supreme Court consider what our Bush administration was doing, or your Bush administration, or somebody's Bush administration, so serious that they actually went back and cited the Magna Carta to remind our government of fundamentals that we have really spent 1,000 years in gaining, regaining, and that were almost lost. To me, it was the beginning of it was the first light at the end of a long, dark tunnel. We're not there by a long shot. And the court, the government is still resisting it, treating that court opinion, and I'll explain that toward the end here, as somewhat as a suggestion rather than as a ruling of the court. The area, as I said, that I focused the most on in the last 2.5 years, my office has done a variety of things from, as I said, in the post-9/11 detentions to a lot of other things. I focused on Guantanamo, enemy combatants, and torture. And I think to talk about that, you have to set it into a post-9/11 context and why the government has been able to get away with what it has, and what are the themes that come out of this period. One of the main themes, and you frequently see this in wars, is maximum power goes to the executive. During a war, the courts generally are quieter. They give the executive more power. After all, the life of the nation is at stake. And there's overreaching by the presidents, as there was, for example, during the Second World War. Even our great President Roosevelt put Japanese citizens and non-citizens alike into detention or concentration camps, 110,000 of them. So there tends to be in wartime a tremendous overreaching by the president, executive, a tremendous giving in by the courts. And this president that we have has taken complete advantage of maximizing his power as the executive. He's pushing aside law and legal restraints, whether they're constitutional restraints, whether they're international law restraints. We saw that with the war with Iraq, of course, right away, where the UN Charter was just cut asunder. The basic document of post-Second World War is the UN Charter that says you can only go to war in two circumstances. One, in self-defense, when you're actually attacked or there's an imminent attack, and secondly, if the UN agrees. Obviously, neither of those were there. The president really just cut apart that Cold War consensus, and of course had the nerve. Today, New York was tied up like a pretzel in terms of me coming here. Both the potential new presidents were there. Bush was there and Kerry was there. Bush had the nerve to address the UN after he almost destroyed it 2 years ago. So one thing you've seen is the international constraint on the use of force has really been severed by the United States. You've seen it in other things that I'm not an expert on, but everything from the Kyoto Climate Accord that we've refused to sign, to our refusal to join the International Criminal Court, pulling out of the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, all kinds of international law that really made this world a possible place to live in which there was some equality among peoples and among nation states. I've, of course, seen it most with Geneva, the Geneva Conventions, where the U.S. where the government, the Bush administration, just said, well, we're deciding not to apply the Geneva Conventions to the people in Guantanamo. I mean, it's not like you can decide to apply them or not. They're a treaty of the United States. The Red Cross said they apply. It was a war of international character. Afghanistan, of course they apply. You can't just say, oh, they don't apply. And then we saw some of those memos that said the president was exempted from the prohibition on torture, that he, in the name of national security, could carry out torture. I call that the Pinochet defense. If you all remember, 1973, Pinochet tortured and killed 3,000 people in Chile in the name of national security. It's no different than those memos. Those memos basically say in the name of national security, the president is exempt from laws of torture. And then we can run through, there was a great, I don't know if people get The Onion here, it's this humor magazine in New York, and they had this picture of Bush saying, we're going to streamline government, we're cutting out the First, Fourth, Fifth, Sixth, and 14th Amendments to the Constitution. And the only thing we're going to do is have obviously the Second Amendment, which is probably dear to a lot of people in Kansas in any case. Anyway, I don't think in my 30 years of being a lawyer that I've ever seen a period of such a destruction of the legal framework by which we govern our use of force, our prohibitions on certain kinds of conduct like torture, and the end of our system of checks and balances. And so when I talk about the system being pre-Enlightenment, medieval, 1214 and 1215, I'm serious. So that's one of the hallmarks of this particular period. A second hallmark is the scapegoating of non-citizens, particularly Muslims and people of Arabic origin, but happening across the board now with any non-citizens. You've all heard a lot about this. Some of it is going on right in Manhattan. Post 9/11 in New York, it was one of the most horrendous things that I've witnessed. Probably over 2,000, certainly 1,500 non-citizen Muslim or Arabic people were picked up off the streets. Not that they were terrorists, not that they'd done anything. A lot of them either because they looked Arab or because landlord complained or there was a family fight. And if they had even the most minor violation, overstaying a visa for 30 days, they were put into either Metropolitan House of Detention in New York or in Passaic County Jail, and they were chained in what we call these three-piece suits, which are what the Guantanamo people are in, where they chain the wrist to the waist, to the legs, to the ankles, and they were put in 24-hour lights, had the heck beaten out of them, and kept in prisons in New York without lawyers, without access to their family. And even after they agreed to be deported, they were kept in those prisons for another year. Then what we still have going on, and what we had after that, was the questioning of thousands and thousands of people, young men who were Muslim. The scorecard so far, a friend of mine, David Cole, who used to work at the center and is a professor at Georgetown, just wrote an article about the Justice Department's questioning of 5,000 people. And he says right now the Justice Department is batting 0 for 5,000 in terms of any prosecutions that have held. And you're all familiar with them. Captain Yi was the chaplain in Guantanamo who was accused of everything from espionage to adultery. Eventually the case completely dropped. Obviously the main criteria for getting Captain Yi was that he was Muslim. You'll all remember the case of Brandon Mayfield. Brandon Mayfield was the guy in Portland, Oregon, converted Muslim. Again, 2 months in detention. Again, if you read the FBI affidavit, it's because he went to a mosque, because he was a converted Muslim, and because once, as a lawyer, he had represented somebody who the FBI thought might be a terrorist. Again, 2 months in prison. He was the one, if you remember, the main thing with him was the fingerprint that was supposedly got him into the Madrid bombing of the train. But of course, when they took the fingerprint from Madrid, the Madrid police said, well, that fingerprint doesn't match. But because the guy was a Muslim, and I believe that was the main reason, they said, oh no, we think it matches. That's it, go to jail. Fingerprint. Eventually freed and now suing the FBI. And I guess you also have recently the Detroit case that Ashcroft had announced, the basic major conviction of terrorists fell apart completely, fraudulent evidence, no good. So what we've had is a series of scapegoating of Muslim people, we can go into more, interrogations, prosecutions, all of which have failed, and of course it's going on for other non-citizens as well. I mean, Guantanamo itself stands for that. Guantanamo is all non-citizens, all Muslim or all people of Arab origin. If you're a citizen, like there was Mr. Hamdi, who was a Muslim citizen of the United States, he didn't stay in Guantanamo, he got taken to the United States. So Guantanamo is a special prison for non-citizen Muslims. Those are two of the characteristics. The evaporation really of law, maximum executive power, and secondly, the attacks on non-citizens. The third characteristic of the present period is the attack on dissent. And in some way I consider, well, they're all, I don't want to compare them here, but dissent to me is what liberty is all about. When I think of the word liberty, I think what that means is my right to stand here and talk to you, my right to go into the streets and protest, my right to carry a sign, my right to really express myself so that I can change the political system. And that's under tremendous attack in the country. In the early days, I think you're again familiar with that, when, remember, Ari Fleischer, the president's press secretary, said, remember, you have to watch what you say and what you do after 9/11. You couldn't question why we might be hated by certain sectors of the world without being called an aider and abetter of terrorism. And, you know, we have this guy, I guess you know him, the actor Tim Robbins in New York. Tim Robbins was they were playing his baseball picture, Bull Durham, at the Baseball Hall of Fame, but after he spoke out against the Iraq War, they disinvited him from having Bull Durham shown. So it goes on and on. There's many, many instances in which you can talk about the attacks on dissent. The FBI spying that's been opened up. I spent the years of the 80s fighting against spying on Central American activists. We put in guidelines into place. We tried to limit FBI spying in the 70s and the 80s. And now, as soon as Ashcroft took over, it's just open season on political dissent in the United States. But the most limits that I've really seen is on the right to protest, and I've seen them firsthand in New York. On February 15th, New York was the only city in the country, that's 2003, when we were protesting the Iraq War. New York was the only city in the country that wasn't allowed to have a demonstration against the war. We had a march, but they would not allow us to congregate in one place. And what's remarkable to me, we didn't just lose in the first court, we lost in one of the most prestigious court of appeals in the United States, the Second Circuit Court of Appeals, which did the usual stuff. Oh, we should never do this again, but there's a security alert, there's a yellow alert or green alert, whatever color, and therefore we can't let you have a demonstration in New York. Remarkable. In all of my years, I never would have expected that in New York City. And of course, the Republican National Convention, and they called it, as I said, they called our warehouse or our garage where they kept people Guantanamo on the Hudson. Now, it isn't Guantanamo. It's not the same as Guantanamo. But the way they arrested and dealt with protesters in New York, apart from not giving us Central Park, as a place of protesting, has characteristics like Guantanamo. First, what they did is they did what's called preemptive arrests. We know what preemptive war means. Preemptive arrests. So they would find out where a demonstration was going to be, like for the War Resisters League, and they would go down to that spot, and with these big orange nets, they would cage in scores of people, everybody from tourists, potential protesters, babysitters, all kinds of things, babies, put them in these nets, and then they would just haul them off to what we call Guantanamo on the Hudson. We had that happen repeatedly in New York, preemptive arrests. When you got to this warehouse on the Hudson, which is Pier 57, it used to garage buses that would leak tons of oil. And all over the ground where you were put in cages, first of all, Guantanamo-like cages. Bigger than that, Guantanamo cages only hold one person, 30 people in a cage, and oil all over the ground. The place had been closed as an environmental hazard, and despite that, people had to sleep in there for a couple of days. And then New York has what's called the 24-hour rule. The 24-hour rule is a good rule. Most states have it. If you're arrested by a cop, you've got to be brought before a judge in 24 hours. Why is that? To avoid a Guantanamo situation where the cops just keep a guy away from the court. So what did they do in New York? Instead of 24 hours, they kept people there from 44 to 60 hours, up to 3 days. And the reason for that? Because they didn't want more protesters in the street. So you had thousands of people in the warehouse and not on the streets. We went to court. The court ordered, a conservative judge ordered the city to bring those people before the courts in 24 hours, or immediately then, 1 hour at that point. The city still lagged. The city was held in contempt, fined $1,000 a person, and today there's still litigation going on about that. So what are the characteristics? Preemptive arrest, like the Guantanamo people, not guilty of anything, at least when they're arrested. Secondly, conditions of detention. And thirdly, no court. One thing that Guantanamo has is a ability, that kind of behavior that we are doing in Guantanamo, that the Bush administration is doing, seeps into the regular justice system, seeps into all of our law, and it really becomes the example of what happens in our regular system. So those are characteristics. You could give more. Those are three that I isolate as characterizing the period that we're in. As I said earlier, how did the Bush administration get away with it? Well, obviously they got away with it through 9/11. It's war and fear in both of them that cloak the president with maximum power, a nation in jeopardy. It's war and fear that obviously it cows a population. People are scared and they look to a leader and they give that leader a huge amount of latitude. And it's war and fear that make dissent unpatriotic. Are you with us or against us? And the president said that. You're either with the terrorists or you're against them. So where does it put people like me or others in this audience? According to the president, I guess, and to John Ashcroft, we're with the terrorists. You remember that famous quote by John Ashcroft? He says, for those who talk about violations of constitutional rights, you're doing nothing but aiding the terrorists. So there you go. And that's what war does. And it is war and fear that brings tyranny abroad, as I think we're doing now, and then tyranny at home. I have this acquaintance, some of you are probably familiar with some of his books. His name is Chris Hedges. He's a New York Times reporter, written a couple of pretty good anti-war books. A couple of years ago, he got booed off the stage for giving approximately the same speech I'm giving now, almost beaten up at a school in Ohio at the commencement speech. And Chris is a classicist, and he always tries to give examples of what's happening now from the classics. And he talked about Athens in the speech, and it's a good passage. What Chris said was, read how Athens, expanding empire, saw it become a tyrant abroad and then a tyrant at home. How the tyranny the Athenian leadership imposed on others, it finally imposed on itself. This, Thucydides wrote, is what doomed Athenian democracy. Athens destroyed itself, for the instrument of empire is war, and war is a poison. And that's what we're feeling today. We're feeling the empire is using war, and war is a poison, and that poison is coming home here to the United States. Another example I always have is, you all probably have read Julius Caesar, the Shakespeare play. And there's that famous scene in the play when, I guess, or they talk about it, when Caesar crosses the Rubicon. And that's really the end of the Roman Republic. That's when Caesar eventually killed many, because people felt he was becoming a tyrant having crossed the Rubicon. The Rubicon was the river north of Rome. And when generals went out, in this case, Caesar had gone out, I think, to conquer Gaul as part of the Roman Empire. It wasn't Roman Republic at that time. He then takes his troops, and for the first time in Roman history, crosses with those troops the Rubicon, and that really ends the Roman Republic. And I thought of it recently when my son took the subway in New York, because there outside our subway are these 5 guys in camouflage suits and AK-47s. So those are the guys that in some way have crossed the Rubicon into the heart of America. So there's that war and that fear is being exploited, and it's being exploited even to win the election. And if you recall a couple of days ago, what Vice President Cheney said, quote, "If John Kerry was elected president," Cheney warned the crowd, "the danger is that we'll get hit again." So what's he appealing to except saying, if you elect Kerry president, Al-Qaeda is going to hit us again because Kerry is president. A direct, absolute appeal to fear. 9/11 gave the president and the Bush administration an incredible opportunity, as I said, to take on maximum power. And you recall what happened immediately after 2001, at least the first actions after the president read My Pet Goat. You remember when he read My Pet Goat? That's in the Michael Moore film. After the second plane hits, the guy sits there for 7 minutes reading to a first or second grade class the rest of My Pet Goat. But after that, it gets less humorous, of course. The first thing that happened was that I mentioned these thousands of arrests of Muslim young men. Second was the Patriot Act. You're all familiar with some of its main issues, from wiretapping to indefinite detentions, going into libraries, FBI spying I've mentioned. Then the authorization that he got to use force anywhere in the world. That was a big one. Congress, our wonderful Congress, gave him an authorization to hunt down, kill, use force against any nation, state, or organization involved in the terrorism of September 11th. And that could be anywhere in the world. It's basically a broad authorization. The president can decide on his own who and when and what to attack. That was really the beginning of the end, in my view, of what we would call a constitutional democracy in the country. And then the president did something that but got me the most active. It's called Military Order Number 1. Military Order Number 1, you don't have to buy the book to read it, you can get it online, but it's in the book. Military Order Number 1 was November 13th, 2001. The president issues it. He's taken control of the world through military orders. And what does it do? It did 2 main things. It said the president had the authority to detain anyone, anywhere in the world. And that person never had to be brought to trial, could be detained indefinitely. And the second thing Military Order Number 1 did, it says that if that person is tried, they can be tried before a military commission. Military commission, of course, didn't exist since the Second World War. It's a made-up kangaroo court that the president made up for purposes of the military order. So that military order, to me, is essentially the takeover by the president, by the Bush administration, the takeover of the world by a man who says he's the war president, which he said on remember that Tim Russert interview, and who believes that essentially he is a war president right now and has the authority, they believe maximum authority, way beyond what the Supreme Court in the decision we won thinks he has, but that was Military Order Number 1. Military Order Number 1, as I said, November 13th, 2001. At that point, I decided, and the Center for Constitutional Rights decided, we were going to represent the first person subjected to the military order, the first person given indefinite detention, the first person tried before a military commission. And we worked and worked until we found the first person who was. That's when Guantanamo began. Think about it. They go into Afghanistan with all the U.S. forces, and they pick up all these people, and they say, well, what are we going to do with these people? They capture all these people. Well, what you normally do with people you pick up in a war, is you treat them under the Geneva Conventions, you call them prisoners of war, you treat them as prisoners of war, and that's very clear. There's just no doubt about it. That's what should have happened in Afghanistan. It doesn't mean they have to be prisoners of war forever, but if they're not going to be prisoners of war, they have to have a hearing in which it's determined they're not prisoners of war. It can be a hearing before a military, three military people, but in fact, Geneva Conventions apply. One, they have to be treated as prisoners of war, and secondly, they have to be treated humanely. Whether they're prisoners of war or not, anybody picked up in a war has to be treated humanely. But what was different is they decided we're not going to do that this time. We're not going to apply the Geneva Conventions to Afghanistan. This is a different situation, the government said. This is a war on terror, not just a war about Afghanistan. We're going to call them enemy combatants. Well, enemy combatants doesn't really have any legal meaning. It's just like saying we're going to call them green chairs. Because if you're like an international lawyer like I am, there's no body of law that attaches to enemy combatants. You can't say they have any rights or status because they're an enemy combatant. You're a prisoner of war covered by the Third Convention, or you're a civilian covered by the Fourth, or if you're none of those, if you're not in a war like you're an alleged terrorist, then you're covered by other human rights documents. So that's why they did it, of course, because they could fill the bottle with whatever they wanted. Enemy combatant, we'll do whatever we want with them. They don't have any real rights. And what they did with the people, first they took them to Kandahar, where they had the heck beaten out of them. My clients will tell you they had guns put to their head, horrendous stories. And then they put them on a plane, which that's the cover of this book. This is the picture of the plane. You can't really see it, but this is the people being transported to Guantanamo. They were strapped down in those big Air Force planes. If you look carefully, there's this, it's a blue-colored, looks like a pad underneath. If any of you have dogs at home, you know the kind of pad you put in your house if the dog goes to the bathroom in your house. That's what it is, because the people were chained down for 24 hours at a time. Obviously, the covered heads, earmuffs, etc. And they decided to take them to Guantanamo. And at that point, we have that famous picture, even more famous than this one, of the crew-cut Marine standing over a bent-down Muslim man, hooded, earmuffs, in the hot Cuban sun in an orange jumpsuit. And when I work and talk with Muslims around the world, they said that photograph, which the United States proudly put out to show what it was doing in the war on terror, that photograph has become iconic in the Muslim world and in the rest of the world for everything the United States is doing wrong in the war on terror. It's what has made us less safe and not more safe. The lawlessness that happened when we took people to Guantanamo, the fact that we were taking them to a place that was essentially a law-free zone, is what eventually led, and we'll get there, directly to the tortures at Abu Ghraib. Now, why did they take them to Guantanamo? I represented people in Guantanamo and were taken there in the early 90s. I represented Haitian refugees. And the reason Haitian refugees were taken there is because Guantanamo is a military base on the island of Cuba that the U.S. has complete jurisdiction and control over, and which the United States government or the Bush administration believes that no law applies, that no court can look at it, that it can do whatever you want. And so when we were representing the Haitians, I remember Ken Starr, the Attorney General at the time, came into the court, and the court says, do you mean to say you can take the Haitian refugees and torture them, throw them into the water, do whatever you want? And Starr says, well, we would never do that. International law wouldn't allow us to do that. But if we did it, there's nothing this court could do about it. They wanted it to be a law-free zone. So when they're thinking to themselves, where are we going to take the people from Afghanistan? We're going to be out of sight, out of mind. It's going to be Guantanamo. One interesting thing about Guantanamo, for years I've worked to get U.S. hands out of Cuba. And for years in my legal life, I insisted that Guantanamo belonged to Cuba, that it was actually a forced lease by the United States when it took over Cuba after the Spanish Civil War after the Spanish-American War of 1898. And the government and the U.S. has always insisted, no, Guantanamo belongs to us. So I go into court both in the Haitian cases and in these cases, and the roles are reversed. Now I'm insisting that Guantanamo really belongs to the United States, because that's who I'm going to get people rights in Guantanamo. And I hear the U.S. government for the first time saying, well, no, sovereignty belongs to Cuba. So I can't, I mean, law makes them strange bedfellows. In any case, that's why they took people to Guantanamo, so they could detain them there. Executive detention is what it's called, without any court. My first client, David Hicks, was my first client, Australian, January 10th, 2002, picked up in Afghanistan, taken to Guantanamo, still there after all this time, and he was one who at the time we took him, they said, most dangerous of the dangerous, worst of the worst, tried to chew through hydraulic lines, all made up, not true at all. Still in Guantanamo to this day. We litigated on behalf of David Hicks, another Australian, and 3 Englishmen, Tipton 3. We went into court, we filed what lawyers call a writ of habeas corpus. Writ of habeas corpus is a fancy Latin word for basically saying, I want to know why I'm being held in prison. And you're required, the jailer is required to come forward and say why you were being held. The burden is on the jailer. We filed a writ of habeas corpus in the lowest court in Washington, D.C., federal court. The court says, no, you can't even open the courthouse door. We're not letting you into the court. Guantanamo, ultimate sovereignty is in Cuba. There's no constitutional rights in Guantanamo. There's no international law rights. There's no jurisdiction is the word we lawyers use. And in a court, you can't even open the door. We go to the Court of Appeals, get killed. It's 2 years of litigation. We've lost everything. But by that time, the climate in the country is changing. We start out where the Center for Constitutional Rights and a few death penalty lawyers who are used to unpopular clients are working with us. By the time the Supreme Court takes the case, we have conservatives, we have Republicans, we have other people who are really concerned by the idea that you can put people into a place that the government, the executive, can simply designate people for indefinite detention for the rest of their lives without bringing them into a court. So when we get into the Supreme Court, we have 50,000 former prisoners of war who say, if we are treating people like this, what's going to happen to prisoners of war of the United States when they're picked up? Not only how are they going to be treated, but what moral stance is the United States going to be able to take? And so we got to the Supreme Court, and lo and behold, we won in the Supreme Court, 6-3. As I said, a strong opinion, quoting the Magna Carta, saying every human being has a right to test. Every human being detained by the United States has a right to test their detention in a court. Now, while we're looking at all of this, and we're litigating all this stuff about detentions and executive detentions, something else is going on in the White House and in the Justice Department. And that's when you talk about the memos, the authorizations, and the acts that eventually led to Abu Ghraib. The first set of memos are incredible. The first set of memos is Alberto Gonzales, the President's Counsel to the President, January 20th, 2002, a few days after David Hicks gets to Guantanamo. It says, this is the President's lawyer, we shouldn't apply the Geneva Conventions to the people in Guantanamo. And it gives some BS reasons. Afghanistan was a failed state. This business about the uniforms, I won't get into that discussion, but they're all BS reasons. Then it gives the real reasons. It says we shouldn't apply the conventions because, as you know, Mr. President, under U.S. law, a violation of the Geneva Conventions, which prohibit inhumane treatment, is a war crime under U.S. law. In other words, if you not just torture somebody, if you treat someone inhumanely, if you deprive them of food, if you forcibly shave their beard, if you put them in a stress position, use a dog as straight torture, but if you do any of that stuff, we can be prosecuted under the U.S. war crime statute. And while it would be unlikely, some future prosecutor may decide to go after us under the U.S. war crime statute. So what's the best defense we could have? Simply say that the Geneva Conventions don't apply, then the war crime statute doesn't apply, good defense to prosecution. Great thinking. But what's great about it is, what's amazing about it, what's shocking about it, is in January 2002, these guys are already writing each other and approving that we don't want the Geneva Convention to apply because we know we're going to abuse people when we get them to Guantanamo. And to his credit, although I must not give him much other credit, is Colin Powell is on the other side of this debate, saying what's going to happen to American soldiers, what's going to happen to 100 years of applying the conventions. Powell loses that debate, unfortunately. And the rest, as we say, is history. Then there's more memos. The other memos, of course, are the ones you've read about. The one that I mentioned that said the president can use torture because in the interest of national security, he is not subjected to the prohibitions on torture. And then there's memos that redefine torture. Let me tell you, taking a dog unmuzzled to a human being who's naked, cowering in a corner, which was done in Guantanamo and done in Abu Ghraib, that's the definition of torture. They redefine it to say torture has to be organ failure. Essentially, you have to die. And that's their way of getting around the prohibitions on torture. So we have the memos that set the framework first for Guantanamo. Then you have, and that's that sheet I gave you, what we call the Rumsfeld sheet. That's the implementation at the highest levels. Nice sheet of paper. This came out of, it's no secret, it came out of the Schlesinger report on Guantanamo. And what it says in here is it lists the various methods of torture and the various interrogation techniques. I don't want to redefine it, but that you can, and if you look in the middle column, just a few things stand out. Stress positions like standing. Well, my clients, the Tipton clients who I interviewed in England after they were released, they were put in positions to a ring, chained to a ring to the floor for 16 hours. Isolation for up to 30 days. They got 90 days. Hooding, which was just common, obviously. Removal of all comfort items, including religious items. Obviously, they were getting it using religion against Muslim people. Removal of clothing, that's all the stripping. Forced grooming, that's the beard stuff. And then exploiting individual phobias, e.g. dogs. This is approved by our Secretary of Defense, and somehow none of these reports have said he should be investigated for this. Sleep adjustment, mild non-injurious pushing. All that amounts to certainly violation of the conventions and torture as well. So we have the highest officials of our government approving torture. And then, of course, we have the acts. We know what happened in Guantanamo. I interviewed 3 of my clients. There's a long report they put out about it, a 115-page report. They eventually, it's on the center's website if you want to read it, ccr-ny.org. They eventually gave false confessions. After a year of this stuff, they said, oh yeah, we were in the Al Farouk training camp. We trained with bin Laden. They gave this whole story because they figured, how is this going to end except if we confess? They had originally said we're in England at the time, but of course they're considered guilty in Guantanamo. And so then what happens? Then British intelligence, because of the stink made in Britain, proves that they were in England at the time they were supposedly this video made of them with bin Laden. They were in England the whole time. They eventually got released. But it's just a story to you about how this kind of, not only is it bad in the sense that it's uncivilized, but it's not getting you what you want to get. And then what happens is you take Guantanamo, no Geneva Conventions, and the blood and the stain that is Guantanamo just spreads to the other places. The government's excuse, the Bush administration's excuse, is incredible. It says it shouldn't have spread to Iraq because in Iraq we applied the Geneva Conventions. We were only allowed to use this in Guantanamo where no conventions applied. Great argument. That you can torture and humiliate and abuse people one place, and you couldn't do it in the other place because the other place the conventions applied. But we know that's not the case. We know that General Miller, who was in charge of Guantanamo, went to Iraq in August 2003 to Gitmoize the Iraq procedures for interrogation because the insurgency was starting up in Iraq. And then 2 months later, the photographs of Abu Ghraib were taken in November, 2 or 3 months later. And so what did General Miller do? But purposely, intentionally, move these Rumsfeld abuses right into Iraq. I'm not saying Rumsfeld here approved sexual pyramiding, but he approved the environment, the softening people up, and techniques that led directly to it. As I said, it's spread to Iraq. The reports that are coming out of our government right now on torture are again trying to cabinet in 7 people, now 27 people. It's leaving alone the chain of command. I'm looking in ways now of getting in the chain of command. Now, some countries like Germany have international laws that you can arrest torturers wherever they're found. So we're looking at laws like that. Maybe Rumsfeld will be afraid to go to Germany. The standard, I should just say, we hung people during the Second World War for what people like Rumsfeld did. I mean, the standard, we hung a general named Yamashita, for abuses in the Philippines. And the standard of proof was knew or should have known. Even these reports say Rumsfeld should have known. Failure of leadership. Bad stuff. As I said when I began, repairing the damage to our country won't be easy. Not easy at all. Not only stopping it while it's still going on, but repairing the damage to any moral authority. You know, these State Department reports we issue every year reporting on torture in Nigeria and military tribunals in Peru. This year, you know, we actually delayed coming out with a State Department report because it was right after Abu Ghraib, and we were obviously embarrassed to do it. But I ask you really, what moral authority does the United States have after this? And when I talk to foreign audiences, they say particularly, you know, we used to look to the model of the United States and its laws, and now our countries look to the models, but the models are very different. So it's not going to be easy to repair this. The victory by the Supreme Court was the beginning. The demonstrations at the Republican National Convention were another, but it's going to take a lot more. And as I said, you know, I've seen the bad in my 30 years, and I've seen the good that can emerge. But the good doesn't follow the bad as day does night. It doesn't follow at all unless you and all of us here make it happen. I'll close on a rap song my son was playing the other day, and it's a little corny. But anyway, it has 3 lines. It goes, speak your mind, free your mind, let's change the direction of this country. Thank you. Questions? Got to be questions here. Yes.
You mentioned police state and you mentioned the end of constitutional democracy. What if President Bush woke up tomorrow and he said, I wanted to declare Michael Moore an enemy combatant? I'm not sure I understand the purport of Rasul versus Bush. What would the government have to prove in order to defend himself against that challenge if there's no legally accepted definition of what an enemy combatant is?
Right. Well, it's a very good question. I mean, what would happen after, there were 3 Supreme Court cases. There was our case, Rasul, at Guantanamo, and there were 2 concerning U.S. citizen combatants, enemy combatants, Padilla and Hamdi. He would come under the Hamdi ruling, which would be better than the Guantanamo at this point. And what they said in that ruling is he has a right to a lawyer and a right to go into court to test the legality of his detention. That's not answering your question, but it's the first level. Hamdi, before this, didn't even get that right. What the government would have to prove, the Hamdi case did give a definition for purposes of Hamdi of an enemy combatant, which is a person who fought in Afghanistan, in the war in Afghanistan, and actually picked up arms. But that's only for purposes of Hamdi. If they picked up Michael Moore and said he's an enemy combatant, they would try to use some kind of vague term like enemy combatant. But it would be, you could test it now. I don't think he could get away with it very easily, but with non-citizens, I think it would be a much easier case.
During the Civil War, Lincoln suspended habeas corpus for comprehension in the North. What is the parallel there?
Lincoln suspended habeas corpus. It was held unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. The Congress then passed a law giving him the right to suspend habeas corpus. Habeas corpus is protected as a constitutional right, as you know, as the question obviously knows. And most people would say that you need congressional authorities to suspend the writ. That was tested during the Civil War. And one of our arguments in these cases were that these were essentially unauthorized suspensions of the writ. We never got there because we got there in other ways. But it would be, the president to do it without Congress, I just think we've come too far along the road. I mean, while I say in many ways I use this term police state, look, we're not a police state yet. We won in the Supreme Court. For some populations in this country, I think it's more akin or moving in that direction than others. I don't want to exaggerate here. I just think there's characteristics that are extremely worrisome.
I guess putting a buffer between the U.S. government
You know, after Abu Ghraib, we decided to sue on behalf of a number of Iraqis for torture. I have some affidavits with me that are much more horrendous than the pictures you've seen. I mean, you know, sexual stuff that's, you know, electroshocks to the tongues. I mean, really bad stuff. And we decided not to sue the United States. I've spent my life suing the United States and losing. And we decided not to sue the United States, and we decided to sue the private contractors, and we sued Titan and Khaki. And the case is pending out in Southern California. And just as an indication, as an aside, of how far off the charts and how far outside law this particular administration is, the firm that is co-counsel and came to us in that case is a Philadelphia firm, mainline, called Montgomery McCracken, which as far as I know is, you know, represented Lockheed at one time or something. And they came to us and said, we cannot stand what's going on in this country anymore. And we want to work with you to sue Titan and Khaki for what's going on. Now, the whole idea that you're using private contractors for government, our high national security job, many people think that is unlawful, actually, without all kinds of special laws and rules. So that's the beginning. The second thing that there was a questionable chain of authority. There was even a questionable chain of authority for military police and military intelligence in those prisons. But for the private contractors, the question was who was their boss, and there were different chains of command. And then there's another question as to, you know, are they subject to things like court-martial and things like that? And the answer is, it's coming out so far, as they may not be. So it's a very muddy area, to put it mildly. And the people were, in my view, at least if we allege in the lawsuit, were not trained. And we actually just moved in the case for a preliminary injunction because one of our lawyers went back to Iraq and found more evidence that torture is continuing. 15-and-a-half-year-old young boy was sodomized recently. And we've asked for an injunction against awarding any more contracts to Khaki, unless, or Titan, I'm not sure, I think it was one or the other, unless they are properly trained. So it's pretty bad stuff.
I'm wondering if you have a belief or at least a theory about why we attacked Iraq.
You know, I mean, I think those, you know, I still believe that it, I mean, there was the theories going from, you know, let's just throw Iraq against the wall and teach all the countries in the world a lesson. That was, I guess, Pearl said that, all the way to oil. And my view is it's more related to economics and oil than anything else. And one of the things when you think of what's the solution in Iraq now, I mean, now it's obviously an utter mess, and it's hard to find very good answers right now. But when you think about the answers, the fact is the U.S. is building 14 military bases in Iraq and has the biggest embassy. I think it's going to be I forgot the number, 300,000 square foot embassy. I may be putting more zeros in there that belong, but huge. What that tells me is that it's going to be a permanent presence in Iraq, and a permanent presence for a reason, and that's probably for continued access to the resources of the country. That would be my. That's what I would say.
You said you were doing everything that you could to fight being detained without charges. Are you guys doing anything to keep people from being apprehended without charges? Because it sounds like, you know, you'll get just, like, people can be picked up off the street and kept for a few days and nobody will notice. What are you trying to do to stop?
Well, there's different categories of people. The demonstrators, that we have contempt proceedings against New York and huge damage cases for people like that in New York. The problem with all these cases is they go on for a long time, and because the political imperative was obviously for Bloomberg, who was Republican, was to make that convention as, what's the way to say it, antiseptic as possible in terms of demonstrators. And therefore, they're not going to care about, they get fined $1,000 for 1,000 demonstrators. That's $1 million. They could lose $5 million. It's worth it for them to do that. And when's the next convention going to be in New York? So yeah, we'll get another ruling insisting that you have to be 24 hours again. And we'll get all kinds of stuff. But it's a hard question as to know what to do with that category. But one way is to try and punish the individuals financially in some way, or even if there's criminal laws, so that they suffer and not just the city. The other categories are another question. I mean, there's the category of non-citizens, which some people here have described for me as being raids and stuff like that, even in Manhattan, Kansas, as opposed to Manhattan, New York, where it goes on quite often. And that's very tough stuff. You know, there's a real attack on immigration, on immigrants in the country right now, across the board. I'm not just being Muslim, Central American, you know, all across. And that again is very hard. It's litigation. And then there's, with regard to people picked up all over the world, you know, the people in Guantanamo are not all from Afghanistan. I didn't describe. There's 584 people there now, maybe 550. What they think they have the right to do is not just pick people up from the war, but I represent 5 clients who were picked up in the Gambia, which is, you know, in Africa, and they were wearing civilian clothes. They were there for to set up a peanut processing factory. So what the authority of the United States or Bush administration is asserting is not just to pick up people in the war zone, but anywhere in the world, take them to Guantanamo, and until we won the Supreme Court decision, not have any hearing. But you're talking about a relatively perennial problem of all states.
You said the Rasul v. Bush decision was 6-3. I'm wondering, what did the 3 say? And do you fear that the majority is in danger if Bush gets reelected or elected for the first time?
Yeah. Okay. What did the 3 say? I don't want to be inaccurate on what the 3 said. That's what I'm trying to remember. One of them, I think, just said one of them said there were 2 ways to win Rasul. One was that Guantanamo was so akin to the United States that it ought to be treated like the United States for purposes of filing these writs of habeas corpus. We won on that issue. We also arguably won on the broader issue that anybody detained anywhere in the world, and this we debated for a long time, anybody detained even in Afghanistan or in Bagram or somewhere, you know, or Iraq, could also bring a writ of habeas corpus. And there's implications in the decision that you could do that as well. We lost. It's a harder issue, obviously. The dissent basically said Guantanamo, in their view, no constitutional rights go to Guantanamo. But I think there was more than one dissent, and I just don't have it on the tip of my tongue right now. And I forgot what Scalia did. Scalia basically said non-citizens, forget about it, I think. So, what was the other part of the question? I'm sorry. Oh, well, we have to count very carefully. I mean, who's there and who's going to retire or who's going to die. So the 6, I'm not sure we would lose. Well, it's possible. Sure. I mean, right now, 4 more years is possible to change. You know, people, women and men are both concerned by the abortion decisions, Roe v. Wade, what might happen to that in a different administration. So I think it's a serious, this year, for some reason, Bush didn't get any appointments so far. So.
I'd like to share with you an experience I had 2 weeks ago concerning racial profiling, what you were talking about immigrants. I ran a foreign exchange program for the state of Kansas that brings teachers from Spain here to work in 11 school districts. And this was approved by the State Board of Education. It's governed under the Fulbright Hayes Act. These are invited scholars who work in Kansas schools. I had a orientation session the 4th, 5th, and 6th of August in Colby, Kansas, for one of the teachers who, for family reasons, couldn't make it to the actual orientation. And so I brought some teachers with me to do this mini orientation. This is a small town, northwest Kansas, very white. And one of my teachers, who is fairly dark-skinned, he's from the Canary Islands, a degree in law, a degree in education, and speaks 5 languages, was taken out of his classroom 2 weeks ago tomorrow by an FBI agent in Lake, Kansas, because somebody in Colby had called the FBI saying there was this foreigner asking questions at the Tourist Information Office about their town. He was held for 3 hours, interrogated by 2 FBI agents. The next day, the FBI was at my door because they had no record of this program. And so I opened up my computer, I took him to the U.S. State Department site, since I'm the responsible officer for the U.S. State Department, and showed them the files that had been there for 3 years. Now, this is happening, you know? I mean, this is an invited scholar in our state who was treated like a terrorist.
You know what's awful about this? I mean, there's a lot of things awful about the story, but here we're sitting in some town in Kansas, and this is going on all over the country, everywhere. I mean, it's and what are, you know what the FBI is going to say. they're going to say, we got this tip, we went to see this guy, and he consented to come. Here's the FBI's discussion is going to be. We saw it to him, Mr. whatever his name is, and he said, would you mind coming down to the station with us? That's what the FBI is going to testify when you sue him, if you sue him. Instead, of course, what really happened is, some other story. I mean, he was intimidated and told, you better come to the station with us. He's a non-citizen here on a visa. He's scared because of that. The immigrant community, not just undocumented immigrants, are extremely vulnerable because of that, extremely vulnerable. And it's a tragedy. I mean, considering that, I don't know, certainly in New York, 35% of our population is immigrant population.
I wrote the mayor of Colby a letter outlining my objections to what had happened, and he wrote back that he was just following the rules and regulations that had been given to him by the federal agents. That any person of color who speaks with an accent is to be considered a possible terrorist.
Wow, that's pretty strong. Well, that sounds like, well, you have that in writing? Are you serious? Well, so wait a second. So that we can do something with, can't we? I mean, that's really strong. I mean, I'm not sure what right away, but I would give it to someone. I'm not sure whether it would be Conyers or somebody in Congress who then makes a huge stink about it and gets a hearing on it of some sort. And secondly, you should do a Freedom of Information Act case right away to get the guy's papers and the files from the FBI. And thirdly, there's probably a lawsuit. But I think a congressional thing would be great, and I'd just be interested.
The problem is our representative is Jim Ryan.
No, I wouldn't go to your representative. No, forget about your representative. You want to go to somebody on the correct committee of Congress, one of the, you could do it. And just stay in touch with me. We'll come up with something in the next couple of weeks. That's pretty shocking to be in a letter. I mean, that's the kind of stuff that the New York Times loves to put on the front page. I mean, seriously. I'm not sure, but it's scary. I mean, it's really scary for non-citizens. I mean, we've been litigating, with non-citizens, you have this special problem that we had this case, it's called the LA-8 case. It's been a deportation case for 18 years in Southern California for Palestinians. And the Supreme Court upheld the right of the government to use First Amendment speech as a factor in deportation. What would normally be First Amendment protected speech? Your politics. So, it's not, we go through these periods in immigration and we're in one of those really bad ones.
You said that this decision was issued end of June. We're now 3 months away. Did I understand you say one person has seen a lawyer?
Yeah. Well,
What's next and how is the department?
yeah, June 28th we won the decision in the Guantanamo cases. And we immediately, because what we figured the government would do at that point, if I don't want to get too complicated, we figured the government would start some kind of hearings in Guantanamo right away as a way of saying when we go into a federal court, there's going to be hearings already, and the federal court is going to have to look at whatever they do as the facts, at least. So we immediately started filing, this word I used, habeas corpus petitions in federal court in Washington. And we filed for 75 people whose families we had gotten consents from. We made a trip to Qatar, made a trip to, the Middle East, a bunch of Europeans. And we got, interestingly, at that point, we had 10 major law firms came forward, Republican law firms, Democratic law firms, the biggest in the country, to work with us and represent people, and they've all taken groups of cases. And then what happened is the government set up special little tribunals down in Guantanamo. They're called Wolfowitz tribunals. They're really called we call them Wolfowitz tribunals. They're called combatant status review tribunals. And they're to determine whether people are enemy combatants, but under not the standard that Justice O'Connor used for an Afghanistani person, but just some vague standard of if they're a terrorist or something. Some standard that doesn't have any meaning. And they're holding these things without lawyers and with people called a personal representative. And the personal representative is not a lawyer, but is a military person. And under the regulations is obligated to tell anything the detainee tells the person is obligated to tell to the military panel who's hearing the case. So it's just interrogation by another method, really. Meanwhile, we've been mucked around in federal court for 3 months by the government saying, the government is required to immediately tell us the reason why a person is detained. And they actually came into court and they said, after holding the people for 3 years, the files aren't together and we can't tell you why any of these people are detained. This is 3 years of detention. So the judge, not to her credit, gave them in our first one we got maybe a week ago, and they're on a rolling basis now for the next, and I'll be here next year. So, I mean, I look at litigation as only, obviously, I only look at it as a very small part of what goes on, because litigation, I think, will eventually, and public outcry and what's happening in other countries, I think Guantanamo is over, I mean, in some way. Because once we get 40 or 50 or 100 attorneys down there, what are they going to do? I mean, they're not going to have much left. And this other thing, these military commissions, which are these criminal law commissions, which some of my clients are in front of, which is separate from everything, that's war crime stuff, those are falling apart completely. Even the prosecutor said the chief judge of it had to resign. I mean, the whole thing is just a mess. It's obviously they just feel they can do whatever. They don't. In some way, they don't really care about it. It's all public relations business. Because Guantanamo doesn't have the people they really care about. The people they really care about, either we don't know about. They're called high-value detainees, and they're in little detention facilities all over the world. There's 14 of them, we think. Maybe they're in Diego Garcia, which is an island between Africa and India, which is an English island. They're in other places around the world. They're in Bagram, and those are people that are, there's really heavy stuff going on in those places. I mean, that's where they admitted they're doing this thing called waterboarding. So you drown people and then make them think they're going to die, and then they come up. And that's open, public. So, the Guantanamo people are, from the people I've met that have been released, I mean, the Tipton guys, I walked into this place, this is in March in Oxford, I'm there for a conference we had, and these three young men come into the room, they're 22 years old, they've been in Guantanamo 2.5 years, they're wearing blue jeans, a shirt like mine, and they're casual, and they've been there for 2.5 years in Guantanamo, all this stuff happened to them, and they reminded me of my kid. I mean, they were like, one of them was there for an arranged marriage, one of them was there to study. I mean, it was crazy. It was just completely outside. And that Rumsfeld got on TV and called them the worst of the worst, and that when I debated Ashcroft once, he said terrorists don't deserve constitutional rights. I mean, but how do you know that? Apart from the fact they do, but how do you know they're terrorists? So anyway.
He was talking about history. You compared our administration to, and I was wondering if you see any similarities to the 1930s in Germany. I know of one. In 1932, the Nazis applied the law with the library. They didn't
Right.
see the records. It's almost similar to what's in the Patriot Act. And I was wondering, do you see any other similarities, and should we be worried?
Well, I'm not a broad historian, so in terms of the whole question of how, the communists versus the Nazis and what happened in the, I don't know about the broad stuff. And on the narrow stuff, I get, again, it's not fascism in this country. It's not a national socialism that we're seeing here. But we're certainly seeing, a squashing of dissent, a tremendous squashing of dissent. We're seeing the idea of indefinite detentions, which is another hallmark. But I haven't really drawn the parallels, and I'd be interested if other people are welcome to address that. I just haven't.
Let me just ask a follow-up on that. It seems to me that the person, as an executive, can sign a paper that someone is a terrorist, let's say, or enemy combatant, or some category to make up, right? And the executive is the person who makes that category up, right? And then says that when someone's in that category, they fall down this memory hole. I mean, this was the attempt, right?
That was the attempt, absolutely.
That's basically laying the legal basis for disappearances.
Right.
The kind of thing that went on under Operation Condor all over the Southern Cone for a decade. Right?
That's exactly what it was. There's no question.
This is basically says, I can sign this and you fall, no one can find out anything about you.
No, that's correct.
We can make a mistake or not, or whatever, we can send you in the end,
No.
we can have some
Right.
process, no one will ever even see the record of. You can be taken out on an aircraft carrier and fired in the back of the skull, like somebody in the Polish forest, and sent overboard. And you're gone.
That's the right example, and it is what, when they said you could sign an order like that, and the president could do that, and the trials on the commissions could be completely in secret, and there was no appeal, and you could be tried on an aircraft carrier and executed, and no one would ever find out about you. That's correct. And, I have to tell you, I think that we still don't know. We don't know the half of it yet. I don't think we know the half of it. Of the case I talked about of the guy who was rendered, Maher Arar, the Canadian citizen who was sent to Syria? Right, well, that's right. Out here, you guys would know what a rendering plan is. No one in the East knows that that's what you do with dead animals to make glue, right, or something like that. But what they did with these, there's hundreds of people like Maher Arar who've been sent to detention facilities in other countries with our cooperation, where the CIA is there and gives the questions. The main countries are Egypt, Morocco. We don't know those people. We don't know those names. We don't know the people in the other detention facilities. They wouldn't give us, they still won't give us the names of the people in Guantanamo, because one, for the reason you're saying they're disappearing people, and secondly, they're creating a league of informants, they hope. So when my clients got released from Guantanamo, they promised them a lot of money if they would rejoin the Muslim community in England and inform on the Muslim community to the U.S. government.
When we were working with the Shah of Iran, I vaguely remember that we were helping him with torture.
With Savak, yeah. With, the agency was called Savak, the spy torture agency of. You know, I don't remember maybe someone else remembers that. We've certainly done that historically. I mean, we all saw what's the movie State of Siege, and about a guy named Dan Mitrione, who was a CIA agent who was helping torture. Right, and I was going to say, then there was the CIA manual that was through the 80s used in Central America, came out of the School of the Americas. I forgot the new name of the school, but authorizing torture. So this has been, what's different to me in a certain sense about the period is memos like that coming out of Rumsfeld. Memos like that coming out of the White House that say we're exempt from laws on torture. At least when they did that, at least the other ways, they at least mouthed that we're against torture. Now they'll mouth it a little bit now, but not really. It was a belief in this government and the administration that they could do that the war on terror justified anything they wanted. And at that point, you might as well say you're the same as Pinochet. I mean, what's the difference?
Well, look, no pictures have been taken of the drive.
100%. You never hear of it.
All these things could have been done forever and forever and forever, and it would be fine.
You know, I followed this stuff really carefully. In 2002, there were 3 articles in the Washington Post by a woman named Dana Priest who talked about murder and torture in Bagram prison. And I used to give my talks. I used to say, what she said in the article, people are hung from the ceiling like that, off the ground for 14 hours at a time, temperature taken down to 0, up to 100. 2 people, Army doctors certified, were homicides from Bagram in 2002. 3 front page articles in the Washington Post. What happened to it? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. We'd still be sitting here but for the pictures. Wait, I'm sorry, I went in front first. How do I suggest immigrants should react when confronted with FBI agents? You should say, I want to talk to my attorney. And you should never, I mean, the thing I have to tell you, because they get people to consent all the time. And they say, don't worry, you won't have to, it's going to go easily, just come down to the station house, you just got to answer a few questions, it'll all go away. Just let us come into your house. People consent all the time. The key for immigrants or non-immigrants is to say, I don't have to talk to you, I want to talk to my attorney. And say, I'm going to call my attorney. And you don't have to let them into your house unless they have a warrant. Now that can be, I'm sitting here in a nice audience. It's hard to do citizen or non-citizen because these guys are clever. And they push, and if you're an immigrant, you're particularly frightened, particularly if you're an undocumented immigrant. I mean, then you're in a whole other situation. But you just shouldn't consent without calling an attorney. And I don't know if you have local attorneys to call, but people should have a number. I mean, this is a tough time we're in. Particularly non-citizens. I mean, we in terms of non-citizens that are at the demonstrations, I like people to protest and demonstrate, but I don't encourage non-citizens to do it as in those kind of situations. You have to be very careful. Other questions? Okay, I'm sorry. Back there, person. Right.
I was prisoner of war commander in Northern Missouri. I summarized an article called Treat Prisoners Humanely. The Pentagon tried to keep this from being published from 1995 to 98. Well, we finally did get it published. I don't think the editor's career did. But why would they be opposed to publishing paper like this during the Clinton administration?
What did it say again?
The title was Treat Prisoners Humanely. It was a summary of
And they were opposed to publishing it in the Clinton administration? It got me. I mean, I don't know, because, I do know that in this administration, when we talk about Guantanamo, there was a general in charge of Guantanamo named Rick Bacchus, a guard guy from Connecticut. And he got fired from the job, and that's when General Miller took over to put the stuff into effect. And what he wanted to do was post copies of the Geneva Conventions on the walls in Guantanamo, and he got fired for that. What? Well, what can I say? It's required. But they don't think the Geneva Conventions apply to Guantanamo. So.
Let me read you a quote from President Bush's 2003 State of the Union address, January 2003. This is a direct quote, no ellipses or editing.
One second. Chris, don't forget to email me, because I really am interested in it. Okay. Thanks.
He said, all told, more than 3,000 suspected terrorists have been arrested in many countries, and many others have met a different fate.
Right.
Let's put it this way. They are no longer a problem for the United States and our friends and allies. Now, how do you interpret that?
How do I interpret it? They've executed people all over the world. Just what Lyman was saying.
That's the way I interpret it.
Yeah, there's no other interpretation. I mean, that's what they've done.
Anybody who watches any mafia show knows what this means.
Yeah, that's what they've done.
So he has confessed publicly, in effect, by implication,
Yes.
to summary execution.
Yeah, that's what they've done.
This is illegal, not only under the Geneva Conventions, but under our own 1996 human rights statute, right?
Correct.
And is it also the case that violators of these laws, if the offense leads to the death of somebody, can themselves be subjected to capital punishment?
Yes, that's correct. That's our U.S. law.
So we
Yeah.
have evidence here for putting the president
Right.
on trial for his life.
It's summary execution. That's absolutely summary execution. Summary execution is execution without trial. So, there you go. Good one. I remember the quote. Other questions?
Do you have any internships?
Sure, we love interns. It's a great place. This year had to be the most exciting place to work probably in the country. For law students or undergrad? Both we have. Yeah, sure. You can just, the website is all over, Center for Constitutional Rights. Send me a note if you see my email. Tell me you were here. And, yeah, we use we have during the summer we have a great program, mostly law students, but, it's been really an exciting place to work. Yes?
Are non-citizens who are being detained
Non-citizens who are being detained?
in jail,
Yeah.
do they have access to attorneys?
Here's the rule. They have a right to an attorney in the sense that if you know an attorney and they let you use the telephone and the attorney happens to answer the phone, you can be there. But here's what happened in Passaic that I described after 9/11. They gave people, after a week, or maybe more, they gave them a list of attorneys, but most of it was out of date. And then they didn't let them use the phone except once a week. And you got one call, and if the attorney wasn't there, you didn't get an attorney, so no one had attorneys. And they wouldn't give us the names of anybody. And the families would tell us the wrong information. They would say, your family's in this prison, and the family would go outside and wait to get in to see their husband or brother or son, and they would be in a different prison in New Jersey. All the time. I mean, the most cruel kind of treatment imaginable. And we've won cases on it. We have a major case pending on that in New York. And what's interesting is the Justice Department itself, which was responsible for that. The Inspector General of the Justice Department, about a year ago, seemed to be an independent guy, issued a report on post 9/11 detentions that verified everything we said in the lawsuit. That people were beaten, they were chained, that lawyers were videotaped, that they didn't give them attorneys. If you can go, it's online probably. It's Inspector Fine's report, Inspector General of the Justice Department. Utterly devastated what they did post 9/11.
You have a scenario in mind about how the consciousness that we have about this now in this room can be translated into the especially the conservative mass media, so that it gets out to the rest of the country?
Well, I think, the conservative thing that we've hit, which if you saw when the tribunals came down, the military commissions, and that order came down, that you saw Sapphire writing a long piece in the Times how outrageous and how lawless these. I'm just saying it's a conservative commentator being very worried about executive detentions. And then I debated a guy on C-SPAN from Heritage Foundation, but in the end he said, Michael, I don't think the Supreme Court should mix in here, but I do think it's about time people should have hearings on Guantanamo. So if I were looking at a strategy around conservatives, it would have to do with overreaching by the executive, because I think there are tremendous concerns by that in the conservative community. But how you reach that is, well, you reach it by going and going to conservative groups and talking and debating and doing what we do as, as public people. I mean, that's one way of doing it. But how you get, because most people, what's the reaction of most people to this? Most people, the reaction is, well, they must be guilty of something. They're non-citizens, they're the other, they're Muslims, I don't care about it, it's not me. And it's not like it, and so what do? You bring it back to what's going to happen to American soldiers. Is that really going to work? I mean, Powell says it, now we have other POWs, but it's not easy. It's really not easy. I mean, look, when I go through the prosecutions that have been brought with great fanfare and then dropped or lost by this administration, and you realize they were all made-up, prejudiced prosecutions, and it still doesn't seem to have a dent. Or what happened here with arrests, and that someone could actually, a mayor of a town could actually say, well, the FBI can investigate someone on skin color. I mean, how are we going to move to the next step? I mean, you guys are as good as me in thinking about this issue. I mean.
With the United States currently trying on proprietorship or forced lease on Guantanamo Bay and Cuba.
Say that again a little louder.
With the United States currently trying on proprietorship or forced lease on Guantanamo Bay, what is their legal status now on actually remaining in Cuba now?
Okay.
Even some sort of invasionary force.
Well, okay, he wants to know what's the status of the lease with regard to Guantanamo Bay. That's basically the question, right? The leases, the parts of the leases, the lease is actually in the book here, but the as I said, after the Spanish Civil War, the U.S. through a series of the Cuban Constitution as well as a series of coercive leases forced the Cuban government to give it 45 square miles of Cuba, which includes the bay. And the lease is one that runs in forever, unless both of the parties, both the Cuban government and the U.S. government, agree to terminate it. So it's a permanent lease. The U.S. pays Cuba $2,000 in gold or something, equivalent of $4,000 a year. Fidel Castro so far, or the Cuban government, has refused to cash the check since 1959, and it takes the public position, and takes the position that is a lease that is not valid, in the sense that it was a coerced lease and that the land ought to be returned to Cuba. The lease terms are, the United States has, quote, complete jurisdiction and control of the 45 square miles. Does that answer your question?
Kind of, but now that the administration does no longer recognize that lease, I believe you said that earlier.
No, here's what they do. It's just a matter of emphasis. I didn't want to be, they still, what the lease says is U.S. has complete jurisdiction and control, but ultimate sovereignty resides in Cuba, which means that Cuba is still ultimately sovereign, although it has no power there. So what the administration was pushing in court was that ultimate sovereignty really is the indicia of whether or not U.S. laws ought to apply there. And because Cuba has ultimate sovereignty, and that the laws shouldn't apply there. And I was saying, well, you guys have complete jurisdiction and control, you United States, and therefore the laws ought to apply there. Okay.
And a reasonable position that is, sir. We'll take one more question.
Okay.
Let Michael go.
Sure.
I just wanted to tell you about the situation here in Manhattan, Kansas, with the arrest of the restaurant workers. And they were
Well, that was the, right. I'm not saying that's not the problem, but that's the way they get around the fact that everybody has a right to call an attorney. And
And we have a few of our bilingual education teachers here who are trying to understand more about constitutional rights so they can tell the difference.
right, what you need is, I mean, I can give you vague stuff, but you really need, I can help you, unless some people in town, you really need a good immigration attorney, better than me. I mean, who has dealt really with, what?
We don't really have one right now. I mean, we have
Well, maybe we can get someone you can talk to. I have a lot of them in New York, so when I'm serious, just contact me and we'll get you somebody either nearby or who can at least talk you through a whole bunch of the issues in the next week or two. It's not a problem. I mean, we have people who deal with this all the time. And this, in New York, it's just people are picked up in Queens, big immigrant communities every day.
But what you said about getting, mobilizing people right away is absolutely true because they were finally allowed access to attorneys and to see their family members because, people like Erlanda and a few of our student leaders got a lot of community people together.
What's the,
Down to the jailhouse within 2 hours.
yeah, it was the key thing. It's great you were able to do that. No, but you knew about it. You see, in a lot of cases, you don't even know about it. I mean, it's great that you were able to do that. But really, seriously, call and let's get some really good advice to people. And, there's groups that, lots of my friends, the American Immigration Law Association, there's lots of people out there to really work on this now. That's it for it? Well, thank you all.